Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of our series, Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. We're very excited to have a special guest today, Robert Pohl, who's going to tell us some untold stories of the Capitol. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague here at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell. Jane?
Sam, thanks for setting the stage, and thank you for your technical support in this activity. We are honored to have each of you signed on with us today for our Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane with a special guest, Robert Pohl. We also always thank you, members, friends, donors to the Capitol Historical Society. These events only exist because of the generous donations. Thank you very much for your support. We really do appreciate it. It is very meaningful to us to be able to tell the story of the Capitol itself and the people who work in the Capitol. And that's why we are so excited today to hear from a distinguished Capitol tour guide. Robert Pohl has worked for many years. He started out as a computer programmer, but he recovered from that to become a full-time stay-at-home dad. Now his son's in school, and so he's expanded his horizons and become a self-taught historian. He's written books about his house, as well as emancipation in the District of Columbia. He has a collection of stories he always wished he had time to tell when he does tours of the Capitol. One of the things you may not know is that he can do tours of the Capitol not only in English, but also in German. So today we're going to hear in English stories about the Capitol Honeymoon fad of the late 19th century, the at times fraught development of the Capitol infrastructure itself, and an often overlooked violent episode on the Senate subway. So join us for an unusual tour. Robert, take us on your tour.
I am indeed a tour guide. So I have a really odd relationship with the Capitol. I mean, there's a lot of people that work there, creating laws or changing laws or lobbying to change the laws, or just the hundreds of people that are responsible for keeping that the whole place going. And of course, then the tour guides themselves. But my job is to take people for whom this may be their only opportunity to see the Capitol and get them on the tour. And that gives me a chance to talk a little bit about the Capitol as I get there. But of course, the major work is then done by the tour guides themselves. By the way, this is Olga Rice. She was one of the very few female guides back in 1938 when the guide service was professionalized. You can't actually see, but she is wearing a brass plate that indicated that she was a guide of the Capitol. Today, of course, it's the red jackets that we all know and respect. And as I said, it's great for me. They do the nuts and bolts of explaining the art, architecture, history, and the work that's done in the Capitol, letting me talk about sort of slightly more personal stories and give a little bit of context to the Capitol. So one of the stories that I almost invariably tell, and this is, wherever they're from in the world, or if they're young or old, I talk about the sledding at the Capitol and how for a while it was banned, and we, dads of Capitol Hill, got together and said, this cannot stand. Sledding on the Capitol is an important thing for our kids to do, and so we all went out one day, and eventually, actually, the law got changed so that it's now legal to sled on Capitol Hill. And even though my son is getting a little old for sledding, whenever there is snow, we go out because we fought for that. So that's one of the stories I really like to tell. It makes it a little more personal what the Capitol Hill is about. The other story that I like to tell is the story about Philip Reed and his importance in the casting of the Statue of Freedom on top of Capitol Dome. that he was an enslaved man who was the guy who figured out how to, first of all, take apart the plaster statue that had been sculpted in Italy, and then to cast the individual pieces so that they could eventually be placed on top of the dome of the Capitol. And of course, the fact that he was a free man on the day that this was completed a year earlier. Lincoln had signed the DC Emancipation Act. So another great story that I like to tell, and that you probably all have heard some parts of. So today, I want to talk about those stories that I don't usually get a chance to tell. Now, I am, along with the tour guide, I also write local history for a blog called The Hill is Home. Once a week, I have a short piece on Capitol Hill history. And finding new topics to look at is kind of an interesting process. Sometimes it's literally somebody will contact me and say, hey, I've been wondering about this. Can you look into that? Other times, what'll happen is that I will find an old guidebook of Washington, D.C., and that will lead me towards something new. So for instance, this story of Philip Reed. Now, a lot of people have researched this, and they keep coming back to this guy here, Wyeth, who wrote a number of books about the Capitol. Usually they talk about a different book as being the source for this. It's actually this book here, Rotunda and Dome, that tells the story about Philip Reed and his crucial importance in casting the Statue of Freedom. So it's very personal. These guidebooks tend to be very personal. They were written at a time when very few people actually traveled. So often it would just be somebody who traveled to DC and wanted to talk about what he or she had seen, so that the folks at home could have that experience as well. So for instance, this book here by a guy named Dr. John Ellis, as far as I can tell, he did not live anywhere in the area, but he just came down once and sort of spent some time in Washington and wrote that up. Ellis is kind of an odd character. I found very little information about him. The only other book that he wrote was sort of very odd, sort of almost conspiracy theory type of book. But this is a pretty straightforward narration. The only thing that's sort of fun about it is the things he gets away with that you would not get away with today. So he talks about going into the, wandering through the Capitol and going into the basement, the sub-basement there, where he saw, and I quote here, iron tubes or pipes extend in every direction overhead. There's no one to be seen, and a deep silence reigns over everything, broken only by the monotonous sound of machinery. Passing on in the direction of this sound, we see two men sitting in armchairs at the end of the passage. And where he actually was the heating plant of the Capitol, which this is a picture of one of the boilers that I found on the Library of Congress website. Otherwise, there's very little information about what it actually looked like down there. But Ellis sort of describes how these two men explained what they did, and they showed him around and showed him this equipment. And I was just thinking, wow, don't try this today. But it does give a very sort of a very personal look at what it would have been like to go through the Capitol back then. The other thing that he talks about, and this is interesting, in going back to the restaurants, talking about the desegregation of restaurants, or that will be the topic shortly. Well, the one he talks about these restaurants, this is Downing's restaurant in the Capitol as well. And how this is, where people get together for a meal, and so you have everybody coming together, lobbyists and legislators, et cetera, et cetera. And that sort of, I know of the restaurants currently, and those are actually operated by the architect of the Capitol or whatever, the powers that be. Back then, these were private enterprises that were given the opportunity to open up down there. One of the stories that I found out in researching about Downing's restaurant was another restaurant called the Hole in the Wall, which was apparently down on the same level as the old Supreme Court chamber, so the lower below the Senate chamber, and it was a round room, 10 foot in diameter, so not big, and was where that's where senators went to eat and to drink. And in fact, that became the problem, that it was closed probably in response to Andrew Johnson's having shown up drunk at his inauguration when he was in 1865 as vice president. So now, as far as I can tell, Johnson actually got drunk in one of his colleagues' office, not in the restaurant. But nonetheless, it was decided that these restaurants were a problem and they were closed, which I found sort of interesting. Now, unfortunately, all the stories that are told about it are sort of retrospective, and so I've found very little further information, and I haven't actually been able to find the actual location of it. I think by looking at old floor plans that I can kind of tell where it would be, but I've never actually had the opportunity to go see what that room is currently used for, if anything. So Ellis, as I mentioned, kind of came through and sort of observed and then went about his business. But another great source are sort of these combination memoirs and guidebooks. And one of these was written by this woman, Mary Clemmer. Now, she's listed as Mary Clemmer Ames here, but really I like to think of her as Mary Clemmer. She was a young, bright woman. She had a knack for writing, and her parents were worried that she wasn't going to do what she was told, and so they married her off to this guy Ames. She actually managed to divorce Ames. In fact, the year before this book came out, nonetheless, she's still listed as with her married name here. As I said, I like to think of her as Mary Clemmer. Mary Clemmer, to me, most importantly, is her writing. I've read a lot of 19th century prose, and I've found that most of it is, well, extremely difficult to read. It tends to be long-winded and convoluted and not very lively. Ms. Clemmer was very different. I actually really enjoy reading her work, and so it was actually a lot of fun to go through this book. Furthermore, she was kind of a fascinating character in and of herself. There's a book that was written in the late 19th century, sort of 50 famous women, written by women. In fact, Clemmer has not only a chapter in it that she wrote on the woman that wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, but she also has a chapter written about her. This picture is actually printed in that book. It shows her observing the Battle of Maryland Heights during the Civil War, and so she really was important there. She was really part of this. This scene she actually incorporated into sort of her first famous book, which was actually a novel that kind of did have sort of autobiographical features to it. But she was also important here in DC. She was a correspondent. She was one of the first women, if not the first woman, to have access to the Senate, to report from there. And so she writes about the Senate. Now, this next picture, this is actually Frank Leslie's magazine, as so many of the pictures. If it's not Frank Leslie's, it's Harper's, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this shows the House of Representatives in, I think, 1883. And now this is before before they've started work, so no wonder that people are kind of hanging about and not paying much attention. But the scene that you see here is exactly how Clemmer actually describes the Senate back in the late 1860s. And once again, we have a quote here. As the president of the Senate seldom listened to a speaker, the senators as rarely took the trouble to listen to each other. The question discussed might be of the gravest import to the whole nation. The speaker's words to himself might be the most tremendous importance to the national weal. Just the same, he had to empty them upon vacancy, speaking to nothing in particular, while the vice president looked another way, and his colleagues went on scribbling letters, whispering political secrets to each other, munching apples in the aisles, or smoking in the open cloakrooms with feet aloft. Now, on the positive side, she actually goes on to say that things have gotten a lot better now. After Henry Wilson, of course, Grant's vice president, took over, and that he actually did listen to his colleagues, and so they actually listened to each other as well. Henry Wilson is, of course, one of my favorite characters, Capitol history. Not only did he introduce the DC Emancipation Act back in 1862, but as vice president, he then died because he was tubbing down in the tubs that members could use in the basement of the Capitol, was called away to a vote, wrapped himself up into a sheet, but didn't really dry off completely, and actually caught his death of cold and died, or at least that's the story. Furthermore, if you're down there in the basement and you get the smell of lavender, well, that's Henry Wilson's ghost who's in there, supposedly still haunting the sub-basement of the Capitol. I haven't noticed that, but if any of you ever do notice that, please let me know. I'd love to hear if he is still down there. So anyway, well, digression there, but getting back to Clemmer, the other thing that she talked about was the newlyweds in the Capitol, which really kind of surprised me. She speaks of newlyweds. She has a long story about how she talks to Jonathan and Judy from Mudville, explains how the Senate works. You know, they're sitting up in the gallery and wondering what's going on. And I was really kind of surprised when I read this because you know, when I think of newlyweds, honeymoons today, I think of Hawaii or Italy or something exotic. And, you know, sort of in the past, sure, there's Niagara Falls, but not Washington, certainly not the Capitol. So I started digging into this, and particularly old newspapers that I found on the Library of Congress website. And it turns out that, yes, absolutely. Wasn't able to find much in the way of direct data. That wasn't something that was kept track of back in those days, or at least not written down. But I did find a speech given by an Indiana senator's wife in which she talks about how many newlyweds do come here. And then going on to looking at anecdotes of the time. So one of my favorite anecdotes was written up in the newspapers. This is actually published in a number of different newspapers across the country. So apparently this newlywed couple came to DC and they were up here on Capitol Hill. But what struck them was not the rotunda or being in the House or Senate galleries or anything like that, but instead the car that traversed the tunnel between the Senate office building and the Capitol. This, of course, for a couple of years, it was a Studebaker that was used for this after the tunnel was built, before they actually built the monorail, which was, of course, later replaced with the little subway that we use today. So this Studebaker is actually kind of a fascinating little item. First of all, it was an electric car. Obviously, you didn't want to have a gas-powered car running back and forth there. But it did not look like this picture because, in fact, it had two driver's seats pointed in different directions. The driver actually sort of sat in the middle of the car, and in order to turn around, he would simply swap seats and then continue, return the way he came. Anyway, so this newlywed couple became intrigued by this car, and so in this article, they talk about how back they rode, and for half an hour they whirled back and forth while the chauffeur smiles and senators chuckled. Wasn't it grand? Chirped the bride as George helped her from the car after the 15th spin. Great, sweetheart, said George. Anyway, love the story. I thought it was amusing that it was published in numerous places, and particularly with this little picture that was added to the story. Now, the other thing that I discovered that newlyweds, or actually I think it was more people who wanted to become newlyweds, would do was to go to the Rogers door. Now, this door is one of these big bronze doors in the Capitol from the rotunda. It's been, if I understand correctly, different places. Today, it leads out to the east front there, to that open area that leads to the east front there. And it shows different scenes from Columbus's life, including here he's being given a letter. But that's not the point of this. What was said back then was that if you could span a certain point on this door, then make a wish, then that wish would come true. So that was described, and this is a 1930 Washington Star article. Make a wish, then open the right hand, spreading the fingers fan-wise. Rest the index finger on the letter, the thumb falls into position on the boot, and the little finger on the monk's head. The wish will come true. So you can see here these 3 points. Now, I don't actually know how much you'd have to span there. I haven't had the opportunity again to go in and look at that. I'm not sure how much they'd like it if I sort of went over and slapped my hand on the door. But I'd love to get a kind of a sense of how big this is, what sort of span is required. In the meantime, if you do want to rub a statue, I recommend you go down to the Einstein statue in front of the National Academies of Science, rub his nose. Apparently that makes you smarter. And if you go down there, you'll notice that the nose is quite shiny. And that's they actually describe that in this article as well, that these 3 points are particularly shiny on this door. Now, what's interesting about this story is that I've tried to see if anybody else has mentioned this, and can find actually no reference to it beyond this one single article that I found. But anyway, as I said, I'm kind of looking forward to once I get back into the Capitol, at least sort of eyeballing it to see how this works. And I love coming back with this sort of lore sort of that kind of got lost. But getting back to our newlyweds, sometimes they would get into trouble, not even necessarily through their own fault, but because they're all over the place and sort of watching what was going on. They would, and this next newlywed actually got arrested, or at least detained, I should say. So the guy here on the left is Rodman Law. That's his sister Ruth Law on the right. Rodman Law was a famous aviator back in the day. And you can see here he's at the controls of an early biplane there. But he was also a stuntman. He actually later had movies made that showed him doing various stunts. And he was known as the human fly because he would climb the outsides of buildings. Well, Law decided one day that he was going to climb the dome of the Capitol. He knew that that wasn't, the thing that people would likely want him to do. So he actually had it spread around that he was going to climb the outside of the Washington Monument. He'd actually, the rumor that he was doing that had gone around even before that, and people had spent, minutes, 15, 20 minutes staring at the side of the Washington Monument, convinced that somebody was climbing out there, before somebody got a little closer and realized that actually it was just some water that had dripped down the side of the monument. That kind of looked, I guess, with sufficient imagination, looked like a human trying to climb that statue, that monument. But anyway, so this day he let it be known that he was going to climb the Washington Monument. So lots of people went out there. There were cameras, crews there, and ready to film his stunt. Instead, he went to the Capitol, went into the rotunda, and he wanted to travel lightly, so he passed his pocketbook to somebody in the rotunda, and he went up the stairs. Between the inside and the outside of the rotunda to get to the top, below the thalos there, and pulled a rope out from underneath his jacket. He'd wrapped that around his waist, slung it around one of the columns, I believe the southernmost column there, and managed to shimmy up onto the column. Got about halfway up the column. He stopped for a cigarette break, and then he continued. He was up there for a while, remarkably long, really, given everything, but he couldn't make it up onto the very top, up onto the statue itself. Unfortunately, as I said, he had told people that he was going to be at the Washington Monument, so there's nobody at the Capitol to actually take a picture of him. So the only thing we have is this picture showing up on the top of the Capitol. That clearly was not done with help of any reference materials, and also even the policeman waving his stick down there was kind of only in the imagination of the drawer. In fact, what happened is that as he came back down, having failed to get up to the statue, and then he this newlywed, and this is where the newlywed comes in, he had been actually up there watching it the whole time, and the husband clipped off a piece of the rope as a souvenir, and then the two of them started going back down into the rotunda. It was at that point that finally the police showed up and grabbed both of them and hauled them away. Now, as far as I can tell, they were simply taken to the police station in the Capitol and released on their own recognizance. In fact, the newlywed, nothing further is mentioned of him, so I can only assume that nothing further happened to him. Remarkably, though, the human fly, as I said, was released as well. He went back to his hotel, and the biggest problem actually that he came that happened to him was that remember he mentioned he had handed off his money, his pocketbook, to somebody in the rotunda. That wasn't a friend of his. That was just somebody standing around there who took advantage of the chaos in that moment when Rodman was captured to hoof it and steal the money. So suddenly Rodman had no money. He had to go back to his hotel and wait for money to be wired to him so that he could pay his hotel bill and then leave. Now, he took full advantage of this time. He talked to a number of newspaper reporters and explained exactly why he hadn't made it all the way up to the top. Now, he said because the top there was rusting out. Certainly possible. He also mentioned that he went down inside the Statue of Freedom there. I'd love to know if that's even possible. Anyway, his story kept sort of getting more and more elaborate the more he talked to people about it. But to be honest, looking at the top there, I suspect he just couldn't make that jump to the top of the Capitol, of that one column there, because it's a pretty big ledge that he would have to get around. But he certainly wasn't going to admit defeat on that ground. So he talked more about how bits and pieces were rusting there, and that he was worried that the statue was actually going to collapse at any moment. Anyway, so that's Rodman Law, the human fly on top of the dome of the Capitol. And now to sort of go completely different direction, although it's kind of related. Remember, I mentioned the couple that was riding the car back and forth, and when I wrote that up, I was like, oh, this will be a good time to add a link back to my write-up of those subways. And I realized I'd never written them. It was like one of those things that I always thought I should get around to doing that, but never had. So I actually went down that rabbit hole and wrote up a series of posts about starting with the cars and then ending with the current Bombardier little Disneyland derived cars that go back and forth between the Senate office buildings and the Capitol. Anyway, and in the process of that, I discovered that there was actually a fairly, well, could have been pretty grim story. There was an attempted assassination on the Senate subway, actually, back when it was still a monorail. And now, I've of course heard and read about and told the stories of the various shootings that have occurred in the Capitol. In fact, in one of my books, there's a long chapter on the Talby shooting back in the 1890s, and how that all happened and how that story has evolved over the years. And of course, the stories of the Puerto Rican separatists that shot up the Capitol, the House floor, and of course the tragic death of the two police officers in the Capitol itself. Those of course I knew. I did not know that there was a further shooting in the Senate subway. Now this happened in 1947, and Senator John Bricker, that's him on the left there, from Ohio, was taking the train over to the Capitol for a vote, and when suddenly a shot rang out, he sort of dove down below the seats and told the driver, "Get moving," which the driver did. Another shot rang out, and but nobody was hit, and Bricker went about his business. The Capitol Police, of course, quickly sprang into action to stop the shooter, and it was actually quite easy to do because the shooter was one of their own, or had been until very recently. That's the guy on the right, William Kaiser, had been a Capitol Police officer until recently, when actually Bricker, Republicans had taken over the Senate, and they had sort of reorganized the Capitol Police, and in that process, Kaiser lost his job. Furthermore, as they researched Kaiser's history, it turned out that he had lost some money in a building and loan society that had been closed by none other than Bricker back in Ohio, and Kaiser blamed him for that as well. Now, remarkably, Kaiser was taken to the Sergeant at Arms office in the Capitol, and Bricker actually came to visit him, and that's where this picture was taken, which sort of really kind of surprised me. Now, the other thing, as this story was researched more, as they looked into it, they couldn't find any actual evidence of any bullets being fired. And there was some thought that possibly Kaiser had actually fired blanks at Bricker rather than actual bullets. So, so in the end, Kaiser was taken to St. Elizabeth's. He died not long after that, but he clearly was unwell, and not long after that actually died in both mentally and physically, and he died not long after that, but he was never charged with anything in this case. Bricker, by the way, has kind of an interesting story. He lived much longer, and if you've read the book The Man in the High Castle, he is actually president of the United States. So according to the timeline in that Philip K. Dick novel that was recently turned into an HBO series, Roosevelt is assassinated in 1934. John Nance Garner takes over as president. The next election, then Bricker is elected president. So he is president of the United States for at least part of the timeline in which that book is set. So I guess that's some way of achieving immortality. The other way is, of course, through stories that I'm going to keep telling now that I've discovered this. Anytime that I get a chance to talk about the Senate subway, of course, I'm going to talk about the shooting in the Senate subway as well. So that's it for the stories that I have to tell, that I've written up here. Put together here. I'm interested at this point if there's been any questions, according to my related to my stories, or sort of in general, what interests, what sort of feedback do we have?
Well, thank you, Robert. What a great set of stories.
Thank you.
a good set of questions from our
Excellent.
audience, and you'll be interested that one of our members of the audience is a tour guide who reports that she had a couple who came with the picture of their honeymoon trip on the East Steps in 1930s. So Judy Floyd has now affirmed your story about the honeymoon activities.
Okay, that's great. Love to see that picture. I mean, it was actually interesting. There was an article in, I think, The Hill not that long ago, where Don Ritchie was quoted as saying that there actually had been one couple that got married in the Capitol. That's of course frowned upon, or simply doesn't happen today. He mentions that they were photographers and took pictures of themselves there, and so I was intrigued. Is like, well, are there any pictures of this? That led down through a whole bunch of other rabbit holes. I'm not going to get into necessarily right now, but I would love to see a picture of honeymooners at the Capitol, because I actually, the closest was that picture from Harper's.
Well, there you go. Other question is, in many of the pictures, the members of the Senate are wearing hats on the floor. And when did that practice change, that people took their hats off to go on the floor of the Senate?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand, to be honest. But yes, I mean, I know the whole story of how Kennedy not wearing a hat at his inauguration sort of killed the hat industry in the United States, and I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly that yes, that you think of today. Of course, you take your hat off when you go inside, and you certainly. I mean, I remember I was in the Senate gallery once, and I was with actually a Capitol police officer. And he forgot to take his hat off when he went in, and one of his colleagues was like, "Hey, don't forget to take your hat off." So it's very much frowned upon today. But I don't know when that switch happened. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. The thing is, with our audience, someone may come in and
exactly. That's
stay tuned.
Right.
And just to return to the honeymoon question again.
Yeah.
Was there a particular time frame where honeymooning at the Capitol was popular?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like late 19th century to like World War II, and because after, I mean, obviously in the World War, there was very little of that anyways, and after the war, then it became more of people would travel further, especially with plane travel being more possible. And so I think it was kind of the Second World War that really that really changed that. And as I said, like still in the 1930s, I would get sort of suggestions that it was happening after 1945. Then nothing.
Okay. And another person, people got fascinated with those pictures you had of the Senate.
Right.
Someone said it looked like some of the people in the Senate pictures were farmers. Were they farmers who were senators, who dressed like farmers, or were farmers coming to talk to the senators?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, it's interesting. Again, we have this sort of sense of decorum today. I mean, that would preclude that, and I mean, the closest you come is that you get people wearing cowboy hats and cowboy boots with their suits when they're here on Capitol Hill. And that's, but I mean, the Capitol was very different back in the 19th century, when what's today the statuary collection, so the old floor of the House of Representatives, was a market for a while after the new wing was built in the 1850s, and so people would comment on sort of the way it felt like a market there, people were not dressed up for it or handling it with any sort of reverence. So I'm not surprised that that extended onto the House or Senate floors, that people did not treat them with the same respect that we do today. But I don't know whether senators who were farmers would then dress the part. I suspect it's more likely that it would be people from home that were visiting them there. Again, the one of the things that every newlywed supposedly did was to go visit the Speaker of the House and get shake his hand and have their picture taken underneath a chandelier that had been taken out of the White House and then put up in the Capitol during one of the Red House renovations. That was removed and it was bought and brought over to the Capitol. And since Grover Cleveland, Francis Folsom had been married underneath this, it was kind of the chandelier that newlyweds wanted to be have their picture taken out. So what I'm getting at is that there was a lot more, a lot less decorum. People were all over the place in the Capitol. And so, yeah, I'm not surprised that people would dress that way on the Senate floor as well.
Got it. One more question that people had is, you were talking about the various incidents of violence, and
Right.
you referred to a shooting in the 1890s.
Yes.
Someone wanted to know, like, what was that shooting about? Who was that?
Well, if you want the full story, I recommend the book on the left there, Wicked Capitol Hill, where I do get into this in great detail. What was Representative Talby from Kentucky? He was a Methodist minister, looked every inch a Methodist minister, and was therefore elected into Congress. He was met a young woman, not his wife, here, and sort of rumors started to fly around because of that. And eventually he decided not to run for re-election. One of the reporters from Kentucky who had sort of been part of breaking that story continued to sort of confront him about whatever. And Talby did not like him. Now, this reporter was a pretty small guy, and Talby, as I said, was pretty tall. And so Talby was constantly taunting him. And eventually, they bumped into each other outside the House chamber. Now, Talby was ex-representative at the time, but he still had the right to go there, and he took advantage of that because it actually becomes kind of real estate agent. So this was his way of making connections to do deals. Anyway, so he runs into the reporter, and there's a little bit of a kerfuffle, and eventually the reporter, the Talby, sort of taunts him. It's like, yeah, maybe you should be armed next time we meet. And in fact, they do meet later that afternoon. This time, the reporter does have a gun. He fires it at Talby, and Talby staggers. He doesn't fall, amazingly enough, but he's taken over to Providence Hospital, just south of here, and looks actually for a while as if he's going to survive, even though he's taken a bullet to the head. But eventually a cyst forms around the bullet in the back of his head, and that presses on his brain, and he dies. The reporter actually managed to avoid punishment as well. Again, they decided that he was kind of crazy at the time, and so he doesn't live much longer either. In fact, the only one that really lived long after that was the wife of Talby, who, excuse me, she died early. It's the girlfriend. She actually she lived right around the corner here on Capitol Hill, but she managed to have sort of a long, happy life. Nobody else did. Anyway, so that's the sort of short form of that story. Now, what's interesting about that story is that that's usually told as a morality tale about this, upright Methodist minister who comes to Washington and is brought low by the swamp that is DC. He becomes a lobbyist, which wasn't exactly true, but again shows how he goes down, and then eventually is shot. And in fact, his wife and his children changed their names. They want nothing to do with them anymore. Again, none of that is true, but it sort of shows this like, oh, this is what happens when you come to Washington. You know, your life goes straight down the gutter. And I realized that this was kind of an urban legend. This was the typical form of an urban legend where a story sort of evolves over time to make for a morality tale, really. And that gets to the second book here on the right, where I do talk about stories like that. Anyway, any other questions?
Well, I think that we have one comment as we close out our hour, and that is that someone said they didn't have a question, but they loved that you had the man in the high castle reference. That really,
yeah, I mean, that was sort of a surprise. I knew nothing about Senator Bricker, because why would I? And so I did a little bit of research on that and discovered this. You know, I mean, he's otherwise, I think there's a couple of federal buildings or state buildings in Ohio that are named after him. But other than that, he's like fallen completely into oblivion. And so I found that just that's like his one little like flicker where he's returned to the limelight. I thought that was really kind of a fun little incident there.
Well, Robert, we are so honored that you took the time to tell the tales and come with us. We also want to remind people that the Capitol Historical Society, one way we support ourselves is from our commemorative merchandise. And if you look right over the shoulder of Mr. Pohl, you will see our bookends. And those bookends are made from marble that was donated to the Society when the Capitol was renovated. And so the marble is pulverized and made into Christmas ornaments, bookends, with replica of the Statue of Freedom, of which you spoke. And so we invite anyone to do that. We're having a summer sale of all kind of summer products. If you want to have an outdoor, properly socially distanced event, we have plasticware, and since the conventions are going to be completely different this year, we have an opportunity. You can get your very own donkey and elephant pins so that you can wear them during the convention to indicate your preference. So Capitol Historical Society is, of course, bipartisan, and we support full participation by everyone. So thank you so much, Robert. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Listeners.
And if I could make one more comment about not only the bookends, but also the books that are in between it, that big one that you see in the middle. I go back to that all the time when I'm researching the Capitol. There's an amazing amount of information in that. It's a great resource. So just a little plug there. And then finally plugging myself over here on Twitter at RSPDC, or RSP_DC, Facebook as Robert Pohl author. And then I mentioned The Hill is Home, where I have weekly columns. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for our listeners. We look forward to having you join us again next week. Take care. Have a good week. Stay safe.